whatever you're comfortable with. Good evening. I know we're in church and that everyone's instinct in church is to move to the back. But given we're going to be an intimate gathering this evening, those of you towards the back might want to move a bit towards the front. If that doesn't seem right, then don't worry about it. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. It's very good to see you. This evening was always going to be something different. We wanted to provide an opportunity not only for ourselves who've been part of the organizing of this exhibition of Dippy, but also those of you who have come along week by week to hear the talks and presentations. Many of you will have been volunteers here in the cathedral and will have experienced people coming through and their reactions. So in a sense, we wanted an opportunity to come together to reflect on what the whole Dippy experience has been like, whether it's for those of us who are involved in the structure of it, or those who've just come along and had the experience. So I hope you'll feel, if you feel so moved, you'll feel able to share something of what your experience and what your thoughts have been around this event. So it's a pleasure to welcome this evening Phil Smith, who is from Teaching Science Norfolk. It's a TSN, I know. But, yeah. Teacher Sciences Network, my apologies. Phil was in on this project from the very beginning because he helped to write the application to the Natural History Museum for Dippy to come here. So it's very good to have him along this evening, and he's going to be sharing some of his memories and reflections on this event. I will do the same, and Canon Andy as well. Apologies that there's only 3 beardy blokes up here to offer these reflections, but I hope that you will make up the lack from the other direction. So thank you for being here, and I'm very happy to hand over to Phil to get us started. Thank you. Phil Smith.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening, everyone. I just think we are so fortunate to be sat here tonight under this magnificent thing. I was really excited back in 2016. I'll take you on a little journey, if I may. 2016, the cathedral was holding its first science festival, which was a move by Dean Jane to sort of bring the cathedral more engaged with the city, more engaged with its tremendous science heritage, primarily that of the Norwich Research Park, which is where I'm physically based. And at that time, we were really excited to be involved. It was a different venue, it was going to be a new audience, and so there was a lot of appetite for science. And it was during one of the meetings planning for that science festival, so 2016, that Jane said, I've seen in the Church Times that they're advertising for host venues for Dippy. What does anyone think? And I put my hand up quite quickly. Yes, let's do it. Why not? Why not try and bring Dippy to a cathedral? And that was the start of it. One simple comment from Jane reporting, a couple of sentences that appeared in the Church Times has led to this. The magnificent Dippy the dinosaur here in Norwich Cathedral. And then, of course, we started to plan, and different working groups were formed, and it's been a pleasure to get to know Peter and Andy, members of the cathedral staff, and then start bringing in other partners. And I was asked in my capacity as the person who wrote the bid together with Jane to bring Dippy here, to chair the education group. Because my charity, the Teacher Scientist Network, works with schools and has done for 25 years now to try and contextualize the science that we see in our curriculum, the science that has to be taught to students. And so what we aim to do is to make real-life connections. And that was why I was involved with the Science Festival idea and why it seemed a natural thing to go on and try and bring something like Dippy here to Norwich and to the cathedral. But what we also try and do is help teachers become up-to-date in science. And so we use the vehicle of the Norwich Research Park and the exciting science that is happening there, and the very current science, of course, that happens at all the institutes and at the university. And we use that as another tool to try and update teachers so that they can pass on our excitement for current science to their pupils, and indeed update their own subject knowledge, because what we find is that many teachers very quickly become out of date. And so I was asked to chair the education group, and we got together a number of different partners, many of whom the ideas of which have hopefully carried through to the final event of having Dippy here in the cathedral. We've worked with the Hawk and Owl Trust, and they've had a residency in the close throughout Dippy's visit. And they've been able to make those links between dinosaurs and birds and the peregrines that nest here every year. We've worked with Norfolk Wildlife Trust. We've worked with the Schools of Science at the university and the university's outreach department. And we've also worked away from the science fair, trying to bring in elements of creativity. So Norwich Writers Association, they were very active working with us in the planning stages. And then became the challenge, okay, you want to tell a story about contemporary science, but how do you do it with a dinosaur that's 150 million years old? And so we started to talk to scientists, and we chose representatives from the Quadram Institute, the School of Environmental Science at UEA, and the John Innes Centre to link to our key themes of global climate change, sustainable food production, and global food security. And those ideas were captured by an extremely talented graphic illustrator called Rebecca Osborne. And I gave Rebecca this challenge. I said, we want to tell science stories, but we don't want you to read lots of words. You know, this visit is going to have thousands of people coming through it, hopefully. This was, of course, back way before we'd had ideas of pandemic in our heads. And at the time, the idea was there were going to be thousands of people through here, clamoring to get a view of Dippy. And they wouldn't be wanting to stop to look at science posters and lots of words. So how could we get those messages and those ideas across in a simple way? And Rebecca was key to it. Rebecca has this wonderful technique, and hopefully in your visits to the cathedral, you've seen her work. They're at the head end of Dippy, and there are those 4 large panels which very succinctly capture elements to do with climate change, to do with where does our food come, how will we sustain a growing population. And we've placed them around Dippy to give them prominence and to hopefully capture people's imagination and catch their eye when they've been here visiting Dippy. Because the skeleton itself was not something we could touch. 25 meters long, itself an iconic structure, itself 100 years old, that has sat, or stood, I should say, in Hinsey Hall at the Natural History Museum for all that time. And so there was a real limit to what we could do. We knew he would be placed in the nave here, and again, how could we tell stories around it? And how could we engage a wider public outside of those not just coming to Norwich? We very much wanted to make Dippy something for the region, something for the county. And with my school's hat on, we were able to do a small exhibition, a touring exhibition, that if any of you have visited Gresson Hall over the summer, you may have seen the outputs of. We worked then with Kate Monroe, a North Norfolk-based artist who's done a lot on climate change and sustainability. And she illustrated the really interesting story that is the focus of Diane Saunders' work at the John Innes Centre. And Diane studies a disease called yellow rust, and yellow rust attacks wheat, and every year the wheat crop is infected by yellow rust, and there is the threat of a second disease called stem rust coming back. It used to be a major problem in this country. And the reason it will come back potentially is the warming climate here in Great Britain. And what we were able to do with Kate was to capture children's thoughts on this story, which focused around a disease caused by a fungus. It focused on a really important crop, that of wheat. And the references, of course, to wheat and to this disease, rust, go back as far as the Bible as well, which was really quite interesting for us. And then the other element to this is a bush that some of you may even have had in your gardens before today, the barberry bush. Barberry is a second home for this fungus. So the fungus comes along in the summer, it causes its disease, it causes a powderiness on the leaves of wheat plants, and thereby reduces the yield. And the question is, what happens to this disease when the wheat goes away? The wheat is harvested, and then it's cut down. Some spores overwinter in the soil and survive, and then others take refuge on the barberry crop. And so they develop and they can mutate on the barberry crop, and then may be able to attack other wheat plants that are grown the following season. So there was a campaign in America. Sorry, I'm going off in so many directions here. There was a campaign in America that involved using the scouts to actually remove barberry bushes because they were so prevalent around the country. And we got Kate to sort of illustrate how the interaction of all these different life cycles was so important to our understanding of where our food comes from. And we worked with 4 different primary schools on this, and their own pieces were reflected in Kate's carvings from metal. Again, a little play on words around this idea of rust. And so we've managed to bring in some of these additional partners and other things to link all the stories together. And I know there's been many other ventures. There's been Sing with Dippy, for example, which I wasn't involved with. But from a science storytelling angle, there's some of the things that I'm very pleased we've been able to do. And we were all sort of, all set for July 2020, Dippy was coming. And then, of course, things changed really quite dramatically. And with that change came uncertainty, and initially the postponement of Dippy Visit 1. And at that point, we didn't know if there would be a visit. And then the months went on, and I think it was around October time, I got a message from Canon Andy that it was all systems go. We were aiming for January. And so Dippy Visit 2 was in our minds. But we were lucky, we had the building blocks in place, and so we were able to sort of pick up where we'd sort of put things on pause and head for Dippy in January. And then, after only about a month of that activity, or 6 weeks, I know, for example, Rebecca had progressed all her interviews and done all the illustrations in that time. But then, the decision was made, no, we must postpone January and think, whether or not it's feasible to have a third visit. So my final reflection and story really for you is really that great relief that one has felt in having Dippy here and having achieved what we set out to do all those years ago. 2016 is a long time ago. I'm reminded of it because I still have the press coverage on the wall in my lab. And it's just so great. My overarching emotion is one of massive relief that we've been able to do this. We've been supported by people throughout the community from the start. I think and I hope we've inspired thousands and thousands of young people to think about science and to remember their time with Dippy, and to think next time we talk about 150 million years ago, they'll be able to think what that time was like through things like the time tunnel that was created in the cloisters. And somehow, what I want to do, I've still not quite worked out, I've got a couple of weeks to think about it. We want to use Dippy's length and this iconic location to try and come up with a little educational resource to help children go back in time so future generations can have this notion of geological time explained to them. That we capitalise on Dippy's great length, and we split time into thinking about distance and use that as a mechanism so that people will remember, oh, I remember seeing Dippy, I remember that tremendous tail, his wonderful rib cage, and how the ribs were maybe spaced out over whatever distance, and that distance can represent 5 million or 10 million years, and then we can have some lasting legacy of the inspiration that we hope we've managed to create having Dippy here in Norwich Cathedral. I'm going to stop. I think I've gone far too long, Peter. I do apologise, but get me talking about Dippy and it's difficult to stop.
Any questions for Phil? It doesn't have to be now, but if anything's come up right away.
I think it was done in about 4 or 5 days. I remember when we first had the discussions with Natural History Museum, they said, oh, we'll allow 2 weeks. We'll need you to close an area off and we'll need 2 weeks to assemble it. And that was a little bit of a shock and potentially a logistical problem for us. And they said, oh, but don't worry, by the time they get to you, because we're the 8th stop, of course, Dippy has been on 7 other venues before reaching Norwich. By the time they get to you, they'll be so much quicker at doing it. And I don't believe that's the case. I think it still takes as long now. It doesn't take 2 weeks, fortunately. But I don't think they've actually got much quicker at putting him together, or her. Okay, you're going to follow me, Peter.
I wanted to share some thoughts about the fact of something coming from a museum, and from a natural history museum in particular, and coming to be in a cathedral. There's a phenomenon of, well, I suppose the 20th century that cultural commentators have offered the thought that that museums have really become the cathedrals of our own age, and that cathedrals have become museums. So museums are where places where people go, whether it's the Tate Modern in London or the Natural History Museum or whatever, but places where people go to marvel at human ingenuity or to marvel at the capacity of human science to resurrect a creature like Dippy that lived 150 million years ago, and to bring it alive, as it were. So museums have this place where we go to marvel at human capacity, human ingenuity, human genius. And because our society, our culture is not one of faith any longer, people still do flock to cathedrals now, but they look at them as artifacts, as historical artifacts. They don't understand or relate to the religious motivations of the people who built it, but they admire the beauty, they admire the great antiquity of a cathedral, and they admire the artistic treasures that are to be found within them. And that kind of dichotomy, I think, was perhaps typical of the 20th century. And whether it's postmodernity or something else that's happening, I think that the relationship between the two has become much less clear-cut than it had been. And that we've come to a point, and I think Dippy's presence here is emblematic of that, we've come to a point where science and faith, in a sense, are much more prepared to be in dialogue with one another. There's a much greater willingness to recognize that both our faith communities and our communities of knowledge have important contributions to make to our life together in the 21st century. And that, if we are to be able to cope with the threat of environmental disaster that lies ahead of us, then we're going to need to draw on all the resources of humanity, all the resources of the human spirit, whether it's scientific knowledge or whether it's the faith traditions of reverence for creation, whatever it might be. But we're going to have to draw on all those resources in order to face the challenges that are ahead of us. And I think that Dippy being here this summer is emblematic of that. There was another exhibition this past summer, which I think shows the other side of the coin, as it were, which is that at the British Museum they had an important exhibition called Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of a Saint. So it was one of the big exhibitions of the summer. And the exhibition drew on an incredibly wide range of resources to bring Thomas's life and times present to those who came, and a representation of just what in a sense, a universal, a European impact the death of Thomas had on the society at the time. So, yes, there was a window from Canterbury Cathedral of Thomas's miracles, but there was also a church font from Sweden which depicted his martyrdom. There was from Norway a stave church-style reliquary that carried relics of Thomas for Christians in Norway. But there was also, besides these artistic treasures, as it were, there was an actual relic of Thomas, a bit of his skull that had been sliced off by the soldiers who came to murder him in Canterbury Cathedral. And it is a phenomenon that happened there this summer, and it's also happened at other times when religious relics have been brought into the museum, that the caretakers have had several times a day to clean the glass from the display case where these relics have been, because people come in and they seek to venerate the relics, even through the glass. They kiss the glass or they touch it, but they are bringing their religious convictions, their religious emotions into a place which, in a sense, was created to be neutral, that was created to be a place where, the remit of religion did not extend. I mean, that was something that belonged in churches. But nevertheless, people have been bringing their religious convictions even into this secular space and engaging in religious devotion. Now, if you think about it from the other point of view, Dippy is a relic in his own right. I mean, Phil was telling us stories about just how careful the Natural History Museum is with this object. I mean, we have to remind ourselves that it's not in an actual skeleton. They aren't the actual bones, but they are a plaster cast that was made back in the beginning of the 20th century. And it's not even unique. I mean, there were 12 other or 11 other casts made at the same time. And yet, Dippy has acquired a place in the heart of the nation that is, difficult to describe any. We would want to call it a national treasure because it is something that's had an impact on so many people's lives. And for the scientific community, this is one of those things that stands as a relic. It is a precious sign of scientific advancement, the advancement in the study of dinosaurs and our capacity to learn how they were constructed, how they lived. I mean, it's the precursor to all those, those fantastic television programs about walking with dinosaurs. In a sense, all of that began with the discovery of Dippy and other dinosaurs and their reconstruction. So there is, in a sense, in which this scientific relic, which has been housed in a scientific cathedral, has now this summer come into a religious home, a house of faith. And it's allowed people to see Dippy in a different context, as one of God's creatures, as it were. And I think that, in a sense, having Dippy in the cathedral has expanded our capacity to understand and appreciate all that Dippy means. It's been, a very difficult year for us in all kinds of ways, and all the threat of climate change, the COVID pandemic, our humiliating exit from Afghanistan. All of these have been very difficult for us to take, to digest, to make sense of. We're bumping up against the limits of the modern Western myth that the capacity of the earth is endless, and that we can have endless economic growth simply by mining the riches of creation. We know this isn't the case now, and we're going to have to learn how to live more simply. And I think that one of the things that both the Thomas à Becket exhibition and Dippy in the cathedral have done is to take us out of our immediate existence and our transitory concerns. They are reminders to us of the imperishability of the divine life that has been breathed into all of God's creatures. They are signs of transcendence and a pledge that within God's providence there is a redemption for all of creation. And for those reasons, I really give great thanks to Phil and to all of those who had the vision to bring Dippy into this place and to allow us to appreciate it in many more dimensions than we were able to before. So thank you. I don't know if you've got any questions or thoughts or reflections about that, but if not, then I will hand over to Andy, who is, among us here in the cathedral, is the one who's really borne the heat and the burden of the day and made sure that everything has happened in such a wonderful way. So, Andy.
I was very fortunate as a child to have some amazing teachers. And in particular, I had amazing science teachers. I remember Dr. Mason, and he was my chemistry teacher. And every time we did any experiment, before we did all those things you had to do about writing it up and proving what had happened and why it had happened, he would say, come here, come and look. And he'd hold up the color that we'd just made or show us the way the gases were coming off this particular chemical reaction. And every time it was about the awe, the wonder, the mystery of it. And in the same way, I had a wonderful biology teacher, George Barnaby. And he liked nothing more than to go into complete ecstasy every time he looked down a microscope. And he'd go on to us about how what we saw down the microscope echoed so much of modern art and would make us appreciate the sheer beauty of what you could see down a microscope. And so I've always had this deep love of science, but my attitude to science has always come from a spirit of awe and wonder. Whenever I hear about science, I'm just struck with awe and wonder at the deep mysteries at the heart of creation. Most recently, we've all benefited from science through the vaccination program, and I'm just in complete awe of the work those scientists did, the kind of understanding of the way the human body works and a virus works and how they knew how to create it. Just awesome. And that's really coloured my response to Dippy. I get to come in here when there's nobody else here, which is one of the great treats of being part of the team here at Norwich Cathedral. And I am just in complete awe and wonder. Because Dippy being here amongst us just makes creation so much bigger and so much more amazing. A planet that is 4.1 billion years old, which is one tiny planet in this particular solar system within our universe, which is a universe probably alongside many other multiverses. The scale, the enormity of creation. And for 150 million years, dinosaurs reigned supreme on this precious little planet of ours. And we human beings are a rather late arrival. If the whole of the history of the Earth is a 24-hour clock, we snuck in at 1 minute to midnight at the end of the day. And I stand in front of Dippy, and I am just caught up in the enormity, the amazing nature of creation. And I'm drawn into the world that he must have known. Where did those feet walk? What did those eyes see? What smells did he smell? What sounds did he hear? And when I look carefully at Dippy's cast here in the cathedral, if you look very carefully along his vertebrae, you can see where all the muscles and the tissues attach, because they're all knobbly and twisted. And I'm back in the dissection room thinking of all the amazing nature of animals and the way they're made. And you look at the size of those bones and that rib cage and the lungs that he must have had. And of course, he's diplodocus, double-beamed, because of that unique bone structure that was needed to support this phenomenal tail, this ridiculously long tail, with, of course, the tiny, tiny head at the other end that ate and ate and ate, and every 35 days needed to grow new teeth so he could continue to eat and eat and eat. It's just amazing. It's just captures the imagination. In my last parish, I had a battle royal with the Victorian Society. The entrance to the porch to this 13th century church was an iron gate with vicious spikes on it. And it spoke of, keep out. And I wanted rid of these horrible, spiky, Victorian additions to my 13th century church. But oh no, the Victorian society were not going to allow this to happen at all, and were going to use every single means to obstruct me. And why, I asked their representative, who dared to come and visit. She did have the grace to say that if she ever visited me again, she would wear a tin hat for protection. She said, because it marks the separation of the sacred and the profane. And I just looked at her and said, no, no, no. The whole world is sacred. And Dippy coming into the cathedral, and the one or two people have said to me, are you sure it's really appropriate for a dinosaur to be in a cathedral? I said, Dippy's sacred, because all of creation is sacred. And maybe if we understood that a little better, we wouldn't be in a climate emergency. God made Dippy, and God made me. And that unites us. And so alongside my awe and my wonder at the mystery of creation, I am drawn deeper into the mystery of faith by Dippy's presence here. This incredible creature, made by God, known by God, loved by God, just as even I was made by God, known by God, and I'm loved by God. And suddenly, it's not just creation that becomes so enormous. God becomes even bigger and more wonderful and more mysterious. So for me, in this place that always evokes awe to me, Dippy adds to the sense of awe, wonder, and mystery. And if time would allow, I could literally stand for hours gazing into his eyes, and in my own little fantasy world, believing that his eyes gaze into mine. Peter has arranged the most amazing series of talks and lectures throughout the whole of Dippy's time here. And I've just loved listening to all those different points of view, and scientists are completely blown away by the idea of being able to tell the color of dinosaurs by some of the chemical deposits in the fossils, particularly the ones discovered within China. But in the end, the one that captured my heart, and perhaps because I come from a spirit of awe and wonder in my approach to science and in my understanding of science, it was the poet who really captured my imagination. And I want to end just by quoting some words of Malcolm Guite that he said in this cathedral. He belonged in the Natural History Museum, but he belongs here. Here we give him a new context. We set him in the midst of sacred space. And by doing that, we do not lose the science, but we gain something else. We gain an awakened wonder. We see Dippy now as part not only of a particular branch of the study of natural history, but also as a part of God's resplendent creation. We can give thanks to God for the long existence of so many splendid creatures. Besides his vastness, we can learn humility. And we can come as his fellow creatures to God, to thank God that we too, like Dippy, are fearfully and wonderfully made.
Thank you, Andy. We'd very much welcome any questions you might have, but I think we'd welcome even more any reflections you might have from your own experiences of Dippy, or however you've been connected with this exhibition and with this experience. If you felt able to share some of that with us, we'd be greatly enriched. Especially those of you who have been volunteers here and have been here day by day, seen how people have reacted and responded, and of course have had your own experiences. So, yeah.
Would Dippy have breathed the same kind of air and drunk the same kind of water that we drink, or would air and water also have evolved?
It's a really interesting question. And I find it amazing. I come back to Andy's final point about awe and wonder. We kind of know now what the air was like in Dippy's time, and that is truly remarkable that we can do that with 150 million years having passed. And the atmosphere was very, very different. We're concerned now about rising carbon dioxide levels. We can't get away from it on the news, unfortunately. But the levels of CO2 at the time of Dippy were massively bigger than they are now. So the simple answer to your question is no. The atmosphere was very, very different. I don't know the details of all the other gases, but there is published work out there about it. And certainly just on one single gas, I think carbon dioxide levels, I'm guessing now, I'm pulling numbers, let's say they're about 2,000 parts per million, and we're now at around 400 parts per million. So really quite significantly different proportions. I would imagine by virtue of the fact that the gas composition was different, the nature of the water may have been a little bit different, but he would certainly have had water, without doubt, and his microbiome would have required water to function. That's why he ate so much. You know, he was eating a lot of plant material. Well, he was eating exclusively plant material, and although that's a very dry diet, he would have required water as well to digest it and to generate energy from it.
I think if I can sort of add a little bit there, I think it's fairly well known now that the oxygen levels there were quite a lot higher, and maybe the oxygen levels being higher was one of the reasons why these creatures could actually grow so large. But the question of where the water came from has not actually been answered. I mean, people have, the latest theory I think is that it came in on comets. You think of the period when, the Hadean period, when there was any water that was around was completely, boiled off. But it came back somewhere, and I don't, and you probably know more than I do, but my understanding is the latest theory that explains the amount, and as somebody said in one of the talks, really, we should be calling this planet water rather than Earth, because there's more water than Earth. Where did it all come from? I don't think anybody's actually come up with an answer that nails it, but I think coming in on multiple comets is the latest one, but I'm sure in a few years' time somebody may have a different opinion. But I'd like to say as well how much I've been to all the lectures, and they've been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed them. And I come from a science background. I look at the cathedral, and the people here who made this were doing science. They did it before it was called science. I mean, about 700 years before they called it science. But what it's called is irrelevant. They were doing material science, geometry, mathematics, all sorts of things that we now give labels to, and people study at university. They were doing it, centuries ago. And everybody who worked on it, who actually left descendants, about 80%, is a direct descendant of everybody in this room today. So there's a real connectedness with this place in the science. And again, with Dippy, I mean, going back 3 billion years to what I think people call the last universal common ancestor, from we all came from that. So Dippy is in some ways a direct descendant of all of us there. I mean, you couldn't possibly work out the links, but it's there. And in the cathedral, as a sort of cathedral of science, to actually create such a fantastic building, science was performed. So going back to what you were saying, there are fantastic links here. And I've only just, I mean, I spent my life with a scientific background. And coming to these lectures has really opened my eyes to the link between science and religion and spirituality. I don't know as I understand it any more than I did beforehand, but it's absolutely fantastic. And I've enjoyed every single one of the lectures. There have been, I think, 9 or 10, I can't remember now, but they've been fantastic. And I think anybody who's been to all of the majority, I hope, would have the same opinion. So thank you very much for organising it. But I've been sort of bowled over, really, as Andy has, whatever, when he was younger. Thank you. Sorry. Ranted.
No, that was lovely.
I suppose if I can just pick up on one of your points there, which was about how much science has happened in the creation of this great building. In a way, that was kind of underpinning the ultimate message of Dippy on Tour. So we see Dippy as a dinosaur. As a dinosaur, that's hopefully going to help some young people think, well, okay, that's about living things, and living things will then lead us to biology. But biology is not a subject in its own right anymore. I mean, it never has been, but the way it's taught in school, everything has its own little silo. But actually, biology can be a way into science, and science can be a way into this thing called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, which is exactly what the cathedral encapsulates. And that's really where we need to go in terms of motivating our young people to think about future careers in STEM. And so somehow there is this tenuous link between this amazing replica of a Diplodocus and inspiring young people into future jobs and building future magnificent buildings, although they're going to look somewhat different to the wonderful stonework we're surrounded by now.
Yes, thank you. My reflections are more along the sociological, psychological aspect of things. I hope that's acceptable. And by the end of next week, I suppose I will have done about 40, 50 sessions here. And the thing that has struck me so much is the wow factor, which has been alluded to already. As people come in the dark entry and they see the cloisters and they see the structure of the cathedral, it begins there. It's as if they feel they're entering a different world from that moment, coming in from the outside with everything that has been on their mind. And so as they walk down the cloisters and then into the hostelry and then into the nave, and that's one of my favorite places, just the entrance to the nave, there is another wow factor. And it's not only about Dippy, it's about its setting. It's about it being in this cathedral. And I remember one woman, her eyes immediately went to the cathedral, and her husband dug her in the ribs and said, "We're here to see Dippy." She said, "No, I'm here to see where he's at, where he is." And that has been absolutely stunning. And I think the other thing that has struck me particularly is the sociological breadth of people who have come. Everyone from different countries, different ages, different educational backgrounds, some with a knowledge of science and asking, for example, what percentage of bones came from the first discovery of the dinosaur. And I had to refer them to the National History Museum. And the students have come and scientists have come, but across the board that has been absolutely stunning. Everyone has come, everyone has been welcomed, and everyone has felt, I believe, welcomed in this place, in Dippy's presence, in the presence of this cathedral. And then I think the last thing I'd like to say is about the children. Because many of the adults, I would say nearly every adult comes in, of course I've seen it at the Natural History Museum, so many people say that, But the children come in, they haven't seen it before. For them, as you have said, it's their memory, it's their first memory, which they will talk about to their children and their families as time goes on. And that for me has been a huge privilege to see them participate in everything that has been provided here, the whole exhibition, not just Dippy himself. And the children come in, they're dressed up in their hats and their clothes and carrying dinosaurs. They're into it 100%. They come in roaring down the dark entry and past my door in the close. And sometimes they frighten themselves. They're roaring and they rush back behind their mother's legs because they're too scared to come in. And others of them have just come running in, Dippy! And as if they're waiting for him to respond. And I like to think he has responded. And I often say to the children, if you go and stand under Dippy's head and wave up to him, he really likes that. Because a lot of people go and look at his tail and he gets a bit lonely at the other end. And I see the children going up and they're standing up on his head and they're waving, hello Dippy, I'm here. It's just magical and deeply spiritual. And I feel so privileged to have been part of this whole exercise. There was a time when I thought I couldn't do it because I'm hard of hearing. That's just gone out of the window. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And I want to thank you, Andy, and you, Peter, and everyone who's been involved. It's been enriching and magical. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything?
What Diane has just said has prompted me to go on and say a bit more about the children, because of course we've had lots, hundreds and hundreds of school children coming in parties since they went back in September. And again, they are absolutely amazing. A lot of the children have quite a good knowledge about dinosaurs. Some of it is perhaps not quite right, but most of it is. They have been really engaged right from little reception classes, 4 years old, which we're in today, right through to the older children. And it's been an amazing experience for them, as Diane said, not only to come into the cathedral, but to see Dippy. And another thing was the Sing to Dippy, which was again the most amazing thing. There were roughly 200 children in here each late afternoon last week, 5 days, singing again underneath Dippy. A lot of them had never been to the cathedral before, but to come in here, sit under Dippy and sing was just an amazing experience for them. And altogether, certainly from the education department, it's been such a great success.
Thank you. Not quite sure how to follow that. Just going back to, I'll just say one, sorry, I'll come back to you in a moment. Just the interesting thing about science is some of the most popular courses that our education department run are science courses in the cathedral, and where they look at all the science of the building, and those are phenomenally popular. So it is something very much that we do celebrate as part of our educational work here. Sorry, was it you, Lydia? Had your hand up again?
I'm sorry to bring this down a level or two, but I don't believe that my great-grandmother was a dinosaur or that my great-grandfather was a fish. And I kind of don't even know if I believe in human evolution as such, simply because our DNA is so different from the closest animal to us.
Is that correct?
funny, I was looking at DNA sequence on the train coming here, and I was looking at the DNA sequence of the pea plant for some work I'm doing with some master's students at John Innes. And DNA can tell us an awful lot about relationships and identity, and it's quite a topical thing these days when, it's in everything, really. Well, quite literally, it is in everything. And one thing that I always share with students is the fact that we are 40% similar when you compare DNA. It depends how you compare it. But on one level, we are 40% similar to a banana. And actually, in terms of our relationships with other mammals, again, I can't quote accurate figures, but I would think we're probably well over 99% similar. So I would probably slightly dispute the lady's notion that we're not actually that similar at a DNA level. DNA is something that we can use to identify ourselves, and slightly contentiously, there are DNA databases out there, and how they're used in the future is going to be another sort of ethical debate associated with science. But actually, one thing that we do when we work with students is say, yeah, your DNA may identify you, but actually it's your actions, how you behave in this life that's going to determine how you are viewed as a person. And I think that's really quite important because we get so much about DNA these days. And I think it's really important to just take that holistic view on, where we might have come from. So DIPI has been put together from a fossilized collection of bones, which for us as scientists is evidence enough of his evolution from other organisms and how we can see him structurally leading us to other organisms that have followed, and to my mind certainly provides evidence of evolution. So.
I'm not disputing evolution, but I am wondering about the human evolution. I don't kind of buy it yet.
I think maybe as more evidence comes out, more DNA evidence, which obviously it took them 25 years to sequence the human genome. That in itself is another marvel of science. And now they can do almost the same thing in 24 hours, which is why we were able to progress so rapidly with things like vaccine development. And so hopefully the evidence is going to become clearer and clearer for everyone to actually appreciate human evolution at a DNA level, because the tools are there, the skill sets are there, and to some extent the evidence is already there.
Anyone else?
Just to sort of come back on that, I absolutely agree with you. Your great-great-grandparent was not a fish any more than people who say we descended from apes. But that is completely misunderstanding evolution. I mean, we descended from creatures who shared our DNA. If you look at the family tree from when we started off this last universal common ancestor, if you go back far enough, you will find a creature that sort of on the same pathway, and then we evolved differently. So what became a fish nowadays and what became us, if you go back enough years there, depending on the complexity of the organism, you have to go further back. So anybody who says we descended from apes has completely misunderstood evolution. And indeed, if you found a creature that was genuinely halfway, a fossilized creature between an ape and a human, you probably need to go back and rethink your Darwinian theory. That's never been found. So you're right, but I still think the evidence for evolution is so clear-cut there. And why shouldn't God have chosen evolution as a mechanism to produce humans? I mean, maybe...
I'm not saying he shouldn't or that he didn't. I'm saying that I don't have enough proof to be
Science...
somehow put here. I'm not saying by God, but somehow put here.
Okay. The evidence is there. Close this down now, otherwise it'll go into...
Well, I think the part of a space like this is that it holds all sorts of, I've no idea what most of the people who've walked through this door do or don't believe in terms of faith, science, or anything else. But they've all been welcomed. And that's what these great cathedrals are all about. They are places where all the question, the debate, the uncertainty, the knowledge, everything can be celebrated, and that's what I love about them. And that's why they're such amazing places. Everybody comes into them with whatever it is they want to bring into it. And Dippy's been part of that palette. Dippy's been able to provoke 1,000,001 conversations and 1,000,001 reactions, and that's fabulous. And, and we've been very careful that we've not kind of said, this is what you've got to feel about Dippy. We've let people discover for themselves how they wanted to. But it is amazing, the commonality of those reactions in terms of awe, wonder, excitement. He's amazing, the building's amazing, and all of that. So there's been recurring things, but that's what I love about cathedrals. They hold many, many things together.
I just want to add one small thing from that on Saturday we had a Benedictine study day, and a speaker was reflecting to us on the Benedictine tradition. And one of the things he said about Benedictine monasteries was that they were places that accepted people and accepted visitors. Whoever came to the door was welcome, and there was never any agenda that the monks were not there to convert people, that the monks were not there to tell them what to think, but they were there to welcome them and to offer them hospitality and to reflect to them the love that God bore to each of them. And I like to think that Dippy being here, in a sense, was true to that tradition, that we welcomed Dippy here, we welcomed every visitor who came here. We weren't inviting them here to tell them what to think or what to do, what to believe, but we were simply offering them this place, this experience, this interaction, as a token of generosity and love and a reflection of that. And so I hope that that's, in a sense, what those 180,000 some visitors who came here will have experienced. Unless there's something that anyone else wants to offer, I think that might be a good place to draw stumps on the evening, as it were. But thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your presence through the lecture series. Thank you for all the volunteers have been doing for this exhibition. And I imagine probably we'll see several of you again before Dippy goes, and I hope continuing after that as well. So thank you for coming this evening.